Cozbi, yes. Feast, fornication, and death. The story of Cozbi and the sins of Shittim. I just mentioned this title to my nephew, and he says, "Is this taking place in Vegas?" And I said, no, I'm going to be up at the AJU. He says, "Can I come?"
He's 12. How old is he?
No, he's a law school graduate, so he's an adult. But then he said, "Tell me what the class is about." And he was sitting at the table with his Sab and Savta, my in-laws. And I said, "I can't. You know, your grandmother and grandfather are right here. I can't tell you what the class is about. It wouldn't be appropriate. They'd be embarrassed. You'd be embarrassed. Just the title alone." You're here because of the title, right? Right? Of course, I'm kidding. And what a great series. Has it been a great series?
Yes.
Every year, it's an amazing series. I've been privileged to teach here a few times, and I always love teaching, and the topics are so wonderful. And the ideas that they come up with, and I recognize a number of you from being in the class when I've taught in the past years, last year, the year before, whatever it was. So it's good to see you all again, and it's really wonderful that you continue your Jewish learning. So you're all experts, right? You're all experts. You all speak Sumerian, Akkadian, Ugaritic, so you know Hebrew fluently. You can look at the Bible and you can analyze and understand it. But if not, just in case, we have the Hebrew, we have the English, so we'll explain it all to you. But my question is this. First of all, what is the purpose of the book of Numbers? Which is kind of a silly question. What's the purpose of the Torah in general? So maybe we should start there. Tell me anything you know about the book of Numbers.
A lot of counting.
There is counting, actually. It begins with a census. And it almost concludes with a census. Actually, in the parsha after the one that we're going to be looking at tonight, there's a census. And what's the purpose of the census?
For the military and also for payment in the synagogue.
Okay, good. Now, what's the real purpose of the census? The real purpose of the census is to prove that the promise that God made to Abraham and the promise that God made to the Jewish people when they left Egypt would be fulfilled despite all of the things that happened along the way in the wilderness. How many people left? How many of the children of Israel left Egypt in Yetziat Mitzrayim, in the Exodus? Approximately 600,000 men plus women and children. And so that census in the very beginning of the book of Numbers shows around 603,000. Then what happens between that moment and the book of Phinehas, where the second census is taken? Exactly. They die. All over the place, left and right. Why do they die? What's that? Yeah, but why do that's who dies. Who dies is the generation of Israelites who left Egypt. Why do they die? Do they die from natural causes? No. Well, some, but primarily how do they die? From sin. They die as part of punishments that God continues to bring upon the children of Israel for the things that they do wrong when they disobey God. When do they disobey God in the book of Numbers? It's a different question. When do they not disobey God in the book of Numbers? Do you need this, by the way? Is this because or can I talk without the mic? You need it? Okay. All right. Sorry. The main moment, right, for the Israelites is fairly early in the book of Numbers when Moshe sends out the spies to spy the land to determine whether or not they are going to not be able to take the land because they already know they're going to get the land. How do they know that? Exactly, because God promised them. So all they're doing is going out to determine the makeup of the land and where the enemies are going to lie, but they should not be worried about victory because God promised them the land. But of course, we know the story. They come back, and 10 of the spies says, it's a beautiful land, it's a magnificent land, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, eretz zavat chalav udvash. However, right? There's no oil. Well, actually, there is now. What did they just discover not too long ago? Natural gas off the shores of the Mediterranean. Tamar, Leviathan, and just a new one they've discovered, but that's for another conversation. Two of the spies come back, Joshua and Caleb, and they say, what are you talking about? Right? Of course, we can survive. Not only can we survive, we can become victorious and we can thrive and we could capture the land because God promised us. The rest of them say, no, 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 we are like grasshoppers and they are like giants. And so God gets angry and says, that's it. You're going to wander through the wilderness and die off. And then we have story after story after story of examples of rebellion and revolt and questioning on who they are and why they should be. And finally, right, they all die off. And then we come to the parsha that is read after the story that we're looking at tonight. And there's a new census. And lo and behold, how many are counted in that census? About 603,000, the same numbers. And they're the ones who enter the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And so, from the beginning of the book of Numbers to the end of the book of Numbers, while it's a new generation, right, that comes in, the promise that God made to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, that I will take you out of Egypt, and the numbers that I take out of Egypt will be the ones that I bring to the land of Israel, holds. Right? That in a nutshell is Numbers. So throughout the book of Numbers are each of these stories which show moments of rebelliousness, moments where they question the authority of Moshe and the authority of God. That's the book of Numbers. Now, what about the book of Deuteronomy? Right? This is going to be important to what it is that we're going to be talking about a little later. What's the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy? What does Deuteronomy mean? To something from duo. It's a retelling. It's Moshe's final speech to the children of Israel as they're about to enter the land of Israel. He does not enter the land with them, but he wants to make sure they know exactly what happened in the past so they will know how to live in the future when they enter the land. And many, many times in Deuteronomy, there are references to events that took place during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness.
Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments?
So the second time in chapter 6, that's right. The Ten Commandments are given in Exodus, which we're going to be reading about this week's Torah portion. If you go to Shul this Shabbat, you will hear Yitro, the Ten Commandments. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, they are given again. Right? Lots of stories are referenced, including this story, including the one that we're going to look at. So I gave you on your sheet of paper a series of sources throughout the Bible where, not all of them, but some of them where this story is mentioned. So in Deuteronomy, what do we have? Your eyes have seen what the Lord did in Baal Peor. For all the men that followed the Baal of Peor, the Lord thy God hath destroyed them from the midst of thee. But ye that did cleave unto the Lord your God are alive, every one of you this day. What is that saying?
Those people get to go into Israel?
Who gets to go into Israel?
Those people, the ones that were good.
Exactly. Those who obeyed God enter the land of Israel. Those who didn't. Yes, sir.
What is the Baal Peor?
Excellent question. That's a fantastic question. That's going to be the focus of what we're going to be looking at tonight. So it's a very good question. That is the worshiping of Peor, perhaps, right? Some kind of idol worshiping, and we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at what really happened and why were the Israelites punished and why were some of them that were not punished able to move forward into the land of Israel. But Deuteronomy makes it very clear, right? If you obey God, all is good. If you don't obey God, right, you will die. Then in Joshua, thus saith the whole congregation of the Lord, what treachery is this that you have committed against the God of Israel to turn away this day from following the Lord, and that you have built an altar to rebel this day against the Lord? Is the iniquity of Peor, there's that reference again, too little for us, from which we have not cleansed ourselves unto this day, although there came a plague upon the congregation of the Lord, and we're going to see that plague as we get into our text, that ye must turn away this day from following the Lord, and it will be, seen ye rebel today against the Lord, that tomorrow he will be wroth with the whole congregation of Israel. So Joshua is warning them, don't do what they did in that moment where it seems like they built an altar and rebelled against the Lord. That's in the book of Joshua. Then you have in the book of Psalms, they join themselves also unto Baal of Peor. So there again is that reference, and it could be idol worship. They ate sacrifices of the dead. Thus they provoked him with their doings. And the plague broke in upon them. Then stood up Phinehas and wrought judgment. And so the plague was stayed, and that was counted unto him for righteousness unto all generations forever. Okay, that's going to be the end of our story this evening. So again, in the book of Psalms, it is referenced. And that finally brings us to our story. But before we go to our story, I want to share with you one more story. Joshua, he is one of the two individuals, along with Caleb, who were sent out as the 12 spies to spy the land. And he and Caleb were the only ones that came back with positive reports. Therefore, they are the only two that were promised to enter the land of Israel. And Joshua is the one who takes over from Moshe. Right? His role is now to teach the people how to survive and how to go to war against the inhabitants of the land of Canaan. So, Joshua secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Shittim. Take a look at the text that I gave you. Numbers 25. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. So this takes place, our story takes place in Shittim, and so too in the very beginning of the book of Joshua, Joshua sends 2 spies out from Shittim, similar to the way that Moshe sent spies out, but Moshe sent 12 out, Joshua sends 2 out. Go reconnoiter the region of Jericho, because this is going to be the first place they come. If you know your geography of the land of Israel, where is Jericho? Jericho is down in the south, and it borders the area of the Jordan, where supposedly the children of Israel are going to cross over the Jordan, enter into the land of Canaan through Jericho, and make their way into the land of Israel. So Jericho is going to be where they're going to battle first. So they set out and they came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. Now notice the similarity. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. So it's no coincidence, I believe, that the story in the book of Joshua reflects what is going to be happening in our story. However, in the book of Joshua, it's very different, and the outcome is very different than what is going to be going on in our story. So they came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, and they lodged there. The king of Jericho was told, some men have come here to spy out. They're Israelites. The king then sent orders to Rahab, produce the men who came to you and who entered your house, for they have come to spy out the whole country. The woman, however, had taken the 2 men and hidden them. It is true, she said, that men did come to me, but I didn't know where they were from. And at dark, when the gate was about to be closed, the men left, and I don't know where the men went. Quick, go after them, for I am sure you can overtake them. So what does Rahab the harlot do? She saves their life. Why does she save their life? We don't know. We don't know. However, she does make a pact. Someone was about to say. Yes. Exactly, and that is what happens. If we read the rest of the story, we'll see that the Israelites come back, they attack, they win, they save Rahab, and she becomes part of the nation of Israel. So here we have a story where you have this woman who is a harlot, who does what is righteous and good for the Israelite nation and saves the people of Israel. Not so in our story, the women of our story. So now let's take a look at our story. And just very quickly, one more time. In Deuteronomy, you have the challenge of foreign women, right, that will lead Israel astray, and the guilty perish. In Joshua, you have the collective nature of the sin and punishment as it's described in Joshua. In Psalms, there's a focus on Phinehas, and then comes our story. And we'll see how our story ties all of these factors together. So, who would like to begin reading Numbers 25, 1 through 13? Actually, let's do this. Let's read the whole story through once, and then we'll go back and we'll read it section by section and attempt to try to understand it better. Do I have a volunteer who would like to read? Thank you.
And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people unto the sacrifices of their gods. And the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself unto the Baal of Peor. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said unto Moses, Take all the chiefs of the people, and hang them up unto the Lord in the face of the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, Slay ye every one of his men that have joined themselves unto the Baal of Peor. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, while they were weeping at the door of the tent of meeting. And when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose up from the midst of the congregation and took a spear in hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the chamber and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel.
See where I got the name, the title of the story?
Yeah. And those that died by the plague were 24,000. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, in that he was very jealous for my sake among them, so that I consumed not the children of Israel in my jealousy. Wherefore say, Behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace, and it shall be unto him and his seed after him a covenant of everlasting priesthood, because he was jealous for his God, and he made atonement for the children of Israel.
Thank you. All right, that was excellent. So, did you notice anything unusual in this story? And we're going to look at it verse by verse. But what do you notice just at a first reading?
God's not to be trifled with.
Yes, number one, God is not to be trifled with. What makes God angry?
When the people turn away from his commandments, his beliefs, his morality and ethics.
Good. What are those beliefs, that morality, and the ethics of God?
Monotheism.
All right, excellent. So number one, primary here is a story about monotheism and idolatry. Right? And Deuteronomy, when I asked you what is the essence of the book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Deuteronomy is that open boundaries are dangerous. The Israelites have been living in the wilderness, protected by God, with a pillar of fire and the clouds of glory surrounding them. They've been protected. And for every nation that they've come upon, God has taken care of those nations and kept the Israelites safe. And over and over again in Deuteronomy, we're going to read about laws as we have to a certain extent in Exodus, more so in Leviticus and a little bit in Numbers, about how these Israelites, God says, are my chosen people. They are an Am Kadosh, a holy nation, a nation set apart. And they should not and must not follow the practices of the Canaanites in the land that they are about to enter. Over and over again in the book of Deuteronomy, we have this idea that once you enter the land of Israel and you're surrounded by all of these different nations, it will be very easy for you Israelites to go astray. And I don't want you to do that, God says. And all of the laws that I'm giving you, from the laws of kashrut to the laws of purity, these are laws that will allow you to know who you are, distinct from the people that you are going to be living amongst. And not only that, but the command in Deuteronomy and even in the book of Joshua is to take the inhabitants of the land that you go to war against and destroy them completely. You know what a cherem is?
Mm-hmm.
Cherem in modern Hebrew means excommunication. But in the Bible, in Deuteronomy and in Joshua, it meant wiping out completely the inhabitants that you go to war with. Because if you destroy them all, if you kill all of them, then you're not going to, not going to assimilate, right? You're not going to buy into the culture of the people in which you live. Because there won't be people that you live next to. It will be your land. So this is the call of Deuteronomy. The challenge in Deuteronomy is number one. Number one, what do you think it is? When you enter the land, what's going to be the most difficult challenge the Israelites will face? In what way? Yes, to resist assimilation or syncretism, joining up their religion with the religions of the idol worshippers, the Baal worshippers. But what's the key? What's the greatest temptation to the Israelites?
Sexuality.
Exactly, sexuality. The women of the land. That is the number one challenge that Deuteronomy is all about. Foreign women, they will lead the Israelite children astray. Many, many times throughout the Bible, but particularly in the book of Deuteronomy. And so we have in the very beginning of the book of Joshua a story of a woman who's not just a woman. Who is she? She's a harlot. She's a prostitute. In the Hebrew, the word is a zonah. And what is the job of a prostitute, of a zonah? Exactly, to tempt you, to lure you in, to take you away from wherever it is that you should be. Right? That's her job. And yet, what does Rahab do in our story that I just read to you? She saves them. She adopts the Israelites and their God and rescues the men from Jericho. So even though the Jews, the Israelites, are commanded to cherem, to destroy everyone when they enter the land, who do they save, as we said earlier? They save this woman, Rahab, and her family. So they go against God's very wishes because this woman protected. She's a zonah, a prostitute, but she's good. Rahab, you know what that name means in Hebrew, Rahab? Wide open. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Yes, that she's a prostitute and her name means wide open. But I think it represents, because names in the Bible always represent, right, something more than the name itself. I think she represents the porous boundaries that Israel represents, the dangers that the Israelites have in entering the land of Canaan. And we're going to see over and over again in the book of Joshua, in the book of Judges, in the book of Samuel, and in the book of Kings, Israelites tempted by the nations that surround them, by the women who live there. There's prostitution. There's also, I'm sure you've studied it with the other rabbis over the course of the year. There's some very gruesome and violent stories in these early prophetic books. All examples of how easy it was for the Israelites to be led astray. But now we have our story. Yes?
Isn't there kind of an ambiguity in the Torah about bringing foreign women in? It's constantly kind of oscillating between staying insular, but then there's all these kind of exceptions that you can bring in.
Yeah.
But they're all conditional.
Excellent. Right? Think about, very good. Well, the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, the Deuteronomist author is very clear. Right? Those you can have no relationships with. But for the women of Midian and Moab, it's much more ambiguous. In fact, who's the most famous woman from Moab in the Bible? Ruth. Exactly, Ruth. Right? And from this woman from Moab, Ruth, who do we get? King David. Right? Talk about ambiguity. There's the perfect example about the ambiguity of the women, because that's really where our story starts. Look again now closely at our story. And Israel abode in Shittim, and the people began to commit harlotry. Shittim, anybody know the reference Shittim? Excellent. Shittim is acacia wood. It's the wood that's used to create the ark, and it's a very strong, hard wood that was used to build the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. So Shittim is, our reference, our mind, when we hear these stories, because they were all originally told orally, is supposed to connect us back to Exodus, where the rules and the laws governing the building of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, are first given. And so when we hear that, we think in our minds the tabernacle. Therefore, our minds should go to something positive. Oh, it's the same wood of the tabernacle. Nothing bad is going to happen. And yet, as soon as we finish that half of a pasuk, that half of a paragraph, the Israel abode in Shittim, the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And what's the Hebrew word that's used for harlotry? Znut, or zanot, zonah, prostitution. Yes?
When they talk about Israel, they're talking about the northern tribes?
No, at this point there is no northern tribe. This is all just the Israelites in the wilderness during the 40 years. This is way before. That doesn't happen until after King Solomon, when his sons divide up Rehoboam and Jeroboam into the north and in the south. But this is before that. So who do they commit harlotry with, of all people? The daughters of Moab. Remember Ruth the Moabite. Now, what kind of harlotry do they commit? When you think harlotry, what do you think? You think sex.
Idol worship.
But the text is not clear. Right? The text is not clear at all. What happens? They, who are the they, called the people unto the sacrifices of their God. Who's the they here? The daughters of Moab. So the daughters of Moab basically invite the Israelite men over for dinner. Right? That's probably what's going on here. Why? The sacrifices of their God. Right? How do we know it's dinner? The people ate. They ate and they bowed down to their gods. Now you have to understand, in ancient times, whenever you would have a meal, a festive meal, amongst these idol-worshiping nations, they would begin the meal by sacrificing an animal to their gods. And then you would sit down and eat the meal. So eating the meal oftentimes was a sign that you accepted whatever was happening. Even, by the way, in the time of the temple and the Mishkan, if you were about to, right? If you wanted to eat an animal that you had, what did you do? You took it to the temple, you gave it to the priest sacrificed it or slaughtered it, he took a piece went to God, and then you took the rest of the animal. Same thing here. So they sit down to a meal, the animal is sacrificed, some of it goes to their God, small g, lower g God, Baal, and the rest of it goes to the people who are eating it. Israel joined himself unto the Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So they start out innocently being called in for a meal. And what happens from the meal, right? They are challenged on their fidelity to God. Their eyes lead them astray. Where do we know that verse that says that you should not be led astray with your eyes? Also in the book of Numbers, at the very end of the story of the spies, when Moshe sends out the spies, as I said, and they come back, the very last section of that Torah portion is the section that we say whenever we say the Shema. It's the third paragraph of the Shema with tzitzit. Vayomer Adonai Moshe lemor daber b'nei Yisrael v'marta aleim v'su lem tzitzit al kanfei b'egedem l'rotam. And it says, V'lo tatur acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem. Do not be led astray by your eyes. And here it seems is an example in the book of Numbers where their eyes are leading them astray. And the zana, the prostitution here, is not in any kind of sexual act, but it is over a meal. It's eating a meat sacrificed to a god. That's an expression of faithlessness. So God is angry. Now, even though there is no mention of sexuality, the way in which this section has always been interpreted by the Midrashim, the commentators, by the early philosophers like Philo and Josephus, was that it was an act of sexuality. It was not an act of eating. So I gave you one example. If you turn the page to the Sifrei Bamidbar, which is an ancient Midrashic commentary on the book of Numbers. And what does it say? And Israel sat in Shittim, and the people began to stray after the daughters of Moab. Sitting in all places connotes subversion of morality, as in connection with the golden calf. And the people sat down to eat and drink. And what do we know happened at the story of the golden calf? Well, according to the text itself, the literal text itself, they sat down, they worshiped this golden calf through eating and drinking and celebration and singing and dancing, but according to the Midrash, it was of a sexual nature during the golden calf story. Not with other people outside of the land of Israel, but it was a sexual act in worship to this golden calf, which was a common practice of the ancient Near East. There are all sorts of cultic sexual practices. And that, according to the Midrash, is what happened during the incident of the golden calf. So another banquet takes place here, according to the Sifrei Bamidbar and the golden calf. And this one is no different than that one. And they sat down to eat bread. Rabbi Akiva says, every section in the Torah which is juxtaposed with another is meant to be learned from. It is written above, come, I, Bilam, will counsel you how to undo Moab. He said to them, the God of this people hates harlotry, and they lust after flaxen garments. Come, I will counsel you, put up tents for them, and seat old women outside and a young girl inside, and let them sell them flaxen garments, etc. So what is going on here? This is in reference to what happens before this story. It's important when we read the Torah, not to just look at the story itself, but to see what happens after and what happens before. So what is the first part of the story of Balak, which is where this Torah portion takes place? Do you remember?
Balak and Balaam.
Exactly. Who is Balak? He was the king who hired Bilam to curse the Israelite nation. Every time Bilam went to curse the Israelite nation, right, God put words into Bilam's mouth and he blessed the nation. And Balak, the king of Moab, got frustrated. And so Bilam is counseling, right, the Moabites how to convince the Israelites, or how to convince them to show that the Israelites will fall by the wayside. And what did they say? This is according to the Midrash what Bilam says to Balak. God of this people hates harlotry. So they will lust after not sex and not food, but linen garments. So here's what you want to do. Put tents up for them. Seat old women outside and young girls inside. What's the goal here? Why the old women outside? No offense, please, well, there's no old women here. But imagine if there were. What's the idea here, right? The old women are the shill. They're the ones who are selling the garments. But what's really going on? Exactly. It's to get the men inside the tent. Because once they're inside the tent, then who's there? The enticing young women who will then sleep with these men and bring them to harlotry and to idolatry, so they will leave their God. And this, Bilam says to Balak, will be the downfall. Because once they commit idolatry, God will reject them and destroy them, and you, Balak, will have nothing to worry about. So this is the Midrash, right? This isn't the text itself, but this is the way that Midrash understands it. Later on, Josephus, who knows these Midrashim very well, says the same thing. They send out all of these beautiful girls to entice the Israelites so that the Israelites will come in. Or, as Philo says, they have the women go out naked, only adorned with jewelry, in the hopes that they will snare the Israelites and bring him into the tent. So from the mind of the later commentaries, these are sexual events that take place. But if we now go back to our text, right, it wasn't a sexual event at all. It was rather an event of idolatry. Okay. Israel joined, I'm back at verse 3 for a second. Israel joined himself unto the Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people, hang them up unto the Lord in the face of the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Now that's an interesting verse. What do you notice in that verse, which is unusual?
He's referring to himself as Lord. The Lord said, Lord will.
Oh, who's saying that? Who's referring to himself as the Lord?
Lord.
The Lord. Okay, so the Lord's referring. Okay, good. And what is it that God is telling Moses that he should do here? How? Yeah. Hang them, right, in public in the face of the sun, almost as if they are to be impaled on a stake, crucified, which is not a typical punishment in the Bible. Nowhere, in fact, does this punishment take place except here. And who is it that Moses is to take? The chiefs of all the people. Now, what's the problem with that, the chiefs of all the people? What does it assume? It assumes that the chiefs are the ones who are committing the zonah, the idolatry. But does it say it's necessarily the chiefs? No, we don't know who it is. So maybe it's making an example of them in the same way that we had the other story of the spies that came out. Here, it might be that God wants to make an example. But why not, right? This was a question that I asked of this test. Why not just impale or punish the guilty? Right? This seems to go against the very nature of how we view the Torah.
But I would think that God thinks that if these are the chiefs, they're supposed to set an example. And if they're not setting an example, that by punishing them, people will learn that they did wrong.
But does that make you feel good?
No.
Right, that answer?
No.
Right, the text is very troublesome, isn't it? I mean, it's troubling to me why God would command this. What does this tell us about God in this story? Very wrathful, very angry. And what is it that makes God so angry and so wrathful? Idolatry. Yeah.
But by killing all the chiefs and sparing the populace, isn't he showing some kind of a restraint? Relatively speaking, of course.
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think God is showing restraint here?
No. He's setting an
He's saying that
example
if this,
in broad daylight,
this
face
happened
of
to
the
them.
sun. It
Yeah,
has to
watch
be
out.
at nighttime or dawn so that it's hidden in any way.
Good. Actually, that's an interesting reference. Do you remember the plagues in Egypt?
Yes.
Do you remember what the 9th plague was?
Darkness.
The plague of darkness. Do you know anything about that 9th plague of darkness? How long did it last for? 3 days. That's right. Why, the Torah says, does it last for 3 days? Well, the Midrash comes along and says it actually wasn't for 3 days, it was 6 days. But what happened during those days of darkness? God, under dark, killed off 4/5 of all of the Israelites in Egypt.
Really?
Why? Because these were Israelites who did not have faith and who were not going to leave Egypt. And so God wiped out 4/5 of the Israelites. It's a midrash. It's a midrash. Wiped out 4/5 of the Israelites in Egypt under the cover of darkness, so the Egyptians wouldn't see what God did to his own people. And here, contrast that with, as you noted, when does this take place? Smack in the middle of the day, right? To set an example, to teach a lesson to the Israelites and to all of the other nations that might observe this. that this is indeed a vengeful and a wrathful and an angry God when you disobey this God. Does this make you feel like you want to worship this God?
Better.
You better. But, right, if we look at it in the context of what the book of Numbers is trying to do in preparation for the Israelites that are about to leave the comfort of the wilderness. And here, remember, here they're being protected by God. This is when they are close with God. Only imagine, and how are they close with God? Because God provides them with all of the manna and all of the water and all of their food, everything they need. They're soon going to be entering the land of Israel, where they don't need God anymore because it's a land flowing with milk and honey. If they disobey God in the wilderness, we could only imagine what's going to happen when the Israelites enter the land of Canaan. Well, we do know, exactly. We do know because we have the book of Judges and Joshua and Samuel and Kings and all the way through until the exile. And then we have all the prophets that say, why were the Israelites exiled? Because they disobeyed God.
But what's so interesting, I've never heard this 4/5 before. And yet the 1/5 left over still did not go.
No, they left. They left.
They left Egypt, but they didn't get into the...
That's correct. Even the 1/5 that left Egypt disobeyed God over and over again and did not make it. There's actually another reference to that idea of 4/5, and that is in last week's Torah portion, Bishalach. In the very beginning of that Torah portion, it says that the Israelites went out of Egypt, chamushim is the Hebrew word that's used. And chamushim means armed. It's translated as armed. But for those of you that speak Hebrew, what does chamushim also mean? 1/5. So the Midrash, which knows the other Midrash of the 4/5 that died in the darkness, see that word chamushim as proof, evidence that only 1/5 of the Israelites came out of Egypt. So here we have many examples, both in the Torah subtly, but in the Midrash very explicitly, of Israelites who did not have faith, who did not trust, who did not believe, and who did not follow God's ways. And we know from last week's Torah portion, right, the Israelites are standing at the edge of the sea in Bishalach, of the Sea of Reeds. And what happens? The great miracle, the sea splits, the Israelites march through, they get to the other side, and what do? Az Yashir Moshe, they sing the song of the sea, and it says, Vayaminu Adonai, right? They believed in God, they had faith in God, and then not but 3 steps later, in the next line, what happens? Where is the water? Where is God? Why did you take us out of Egypt? There were enough graves in Egypt, right? And then, where is the food? And then God says to them, okay, here's the manna. I'll give it to you. I'm going to give you a double portion on Friday, so don't take on Saturday. And what do? They take on Saturday. Right? Stubborn. These people don't learn. So these are the stories in the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers, all in preparation to try to clearly hammer into these people that they need to be faithful to God. They must be faithful to God. And so you have a God that, in this sense, takes no prisoners, that would impale not just the guilty, but all of the leaders. Now the issue, though, is does Moshe obey God or not? Right? God says to Moses, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them up unto the Lord and face the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. And now look at verse 5. And Moses said unto the judges of Israel, slay ye every one of his men that have joined themselves unto the Baal of Peor. So what does Moses do? He disobeys God. Interesting. And what does the text tell us about that? How does God respond? Nothing. Silence. Why does Moshe disobey God? And even more interestingly, why does the text not tell us or show us anything about this? Why do you think, I think it's easy for us to understand why Moshe disobeys God. Because it doesn't feel just. It doesn't feel right. It's almost as if, were you ever in a moment when you were parenting, losing control of yourself when your kids misbehave, and you said something that as soon as you said it, you wanted to take it back. You regretted it, right? Did you ever, right, say if you, whatever it is, and then you throw out some horrific punishment, I'm going to take away, the television for the next 10 years. You're not going to drive a car for the next 15 months, whatever it is. And that's completely unrealistic. Right? It's just not going to happen. Well, so maybe Moshe is saying here we've got a petulant God, right? A God who is losing control because God is so frustrated with his children that he lashes out, and Moshe says, I know, God, I know what you said, but let's be serious. I'm not going to impale the leaders here. That's not going to look good for you, it's not going to look good for me, and it's not going to look good for the Jews of the 21st century who are reading this story at AJU. Right? It's not going to look good. So instead, God, I know what you meant, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's what Moshe does. And God doesn't blink an eye. We don't have any comment here that says that God was angry at Moshe for disobeying him. So obviously, God was okay with it. Yes, a cool down period. And this is not the first time that Moshe stands up to God, right? Moshe stands up to God at the golden calf. Moshe stands up to him at the spies. There's no number of times where Moshe says, you know what, God, you want to wipe out all the people, wipe them all out, but take me out of your book because I won't be part of it. So here's an example, I think a beautiful example of Moshe doing what's right and just before the God of Israel and before the nations. Okay. Now, all of a sudden, in the midst of this story, yes, it is. Very good. All of a sudden, in the midst of this story where we're dealing with the women of Moab, the daughters of Moab, and them inviting these people in to have a meal, and the meal turning into, unfortunately, according to the text, an idolatry bash, according to the Midrash, some kind of sexual encounter. All of a sudden, look at what happens in verse 6. And behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel while they were weeping at the door of the tent of meeting. First of all, why are they weeping at the door of the tent of meeting? Right? Because a whole bunch of people were killed. In the midst of this killing, you have a very interesting line. One of the children of Israel, who's not mentioned here, but we know who he is by mentioning him later. Who is he? Zimri. Zimri came and brought a Midianite woman. Who's the Midianite woman? Cozbi. In the sight of Moses, in the sight of the congregation, the children of Israel, while they are weeping for those who just died. The story comes out of nowhere. It's almost as if there's two different stories that are going on, and somehow they're placed together, because the first story takes place with the Moabite woman. Now this story takes place with a Midianite woman. But again, as I forgot your name already, Linda said, that there's great ambiguity with regard to the Moabites and the Midianites. And so we have one story each put together in this little passage, right, with two of these with these women that are potentially leading the Israelites astray. Yeah.
Can you remind us again what country Moses' wife?
Midianite. Very good. Thank you. Excellent.
Yeah.
Right? Zipporah was a Midianite. And her father, what's his name? Jethro. He gets an entire portion named after him that we're going to be reading this week. Moshe doesn't get a portion, although he gets the name of the book, right? The 5 books of Moses. but Yitro. So what's our relationship to these Midianites? It's very unclear. It's mixed. It's ambiguous. Moses married a Midianite woman. And what happened to Moses because he married a Midianite woman? Nothing. In fact, what do we know about this Midianite woman that Moses married?
Saved his life.
Saved his life. Exactly, in a story that was very, very mysterious. Very bizarre. In chapter 3, in the very beginning of the book of Exodus, when Moses is on his way back to meet Pharaoh after God commanded him to go back, all of a sudden there's this odd story. It's only a few verses. And it's called The Blood of the Bridegroom. That's the way the story is told. At the night encampment on the way, the Lord encountered him and sought to kill him. So Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his legs with it, saying, "You are truly a bridegroom of blood to me." And when he let him alone, she added, "A bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision." Right? It's as mysterious as another night encounter. What was the other night encounter that was very mysterious? The encounter between, remember Jacob? Jacob at the wrestling match with the man. And we don't know who's who. Right? There's pronouns. There's not proper names, so we don't know what's going on. But here in this story, we have Zipporah the Midianite who saves Moshe from being harmed by God or an angel or something like that, because maybe Moshe didn't circumcise his son, so Zipporah circumcised his son. So now we have another Midianite. And here this Midianite woman is brought by, and her name is Zimri, Cozbi, brought by this guy Zimri. What are they doing together?
Having sex in the tent.
Well, it certainly would appear that is the case. However, let's look carefully. Right? Where does it say sex? Find the word sex. We're usually pretty good at finding sex. So you tell me where we see sex going on here. No. Well, let's turn to the commentary for a second. Oh, you know what? I don't think I gave it to you. You know what? I didn't give it to you. I have it. I'm sorry. I meant to print it, but I didn't print it. So I'm going to read it to you. Okay, the tribe of Shimon came to Zimri. "You are sitting in peace while we are being slaughtered." Whereupon he gathered 24,000 of his tribe, came to Cozbi and said to her, "Consent with me." She says, "I will consent only to the greatest of you, someone like Moses your master." He said, "I too am a chief of the tribe. Consent with me. And what's more, I'm greater than Moshe." Right? Because my father was Shimon, being second of the womb of Leah, while he is Levi. He's third. Very clever of Zimri. So saying that this is in the Sifra, saying that he seized her and stood her in the midst of all of Israel. Thus it says, "And behold, a man of the children of Israel came and brought near to his brothers a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, in the sight of the entire children of Israel, and the women wept. At that time, Phinehas cried out, 'Is there no one here who is ready to kill and be killed? Where are the lions of Judah? Where is Dan?' Whereupon he began to shout. Seeing that all remained silent, he arose from his Sanhedrin." Do you get it? In other words, he's judging. He's at the court of law, so he's not taking the law into his own hands. There's judgment that's going on. He took out his spear, and he placed the blade in the hollow belt, supporting himself on its haft, and he left. Seeing him about to enter the tent, they called out to him, "Phinehas, where are you going?" He replied, "Is Levi always to be greater than Shimon? I will show you what I can do." At which they said to him, "Let him go." Once he entered, the Lord performed 6 miracles. The first, normally they would have separated upon his entrance, right? Zimri and Cozbi. But the angel kept them joined together. Okay, you can only close your eyes and imagine what's going on. That's the first miracle. The second, the angel sealed their mouths so they could not cry out. The third miracle, he transfixed them with the spear in their conjoined genitals for the benefit of the skeptics. Who are the skeptics? The ones who might say they weren't doing anything wrong. They were only, reading a library book. They were having a cup of tea. They were exchanging stories of their gods. No. He spared them where? Smack in their conjoined genitals, so that nobody could deny their cohabitation and maintain that they had gone in for that very purpose. The fourth miracle, they did not slide off from the spear, but remained in their places. Hey, I didn't write this. I'm only sharing it. The fifth, the angel lifted the lintel so that they both could appear to all slung from his shoulders. In other words, lifted the tent so that everybody can see what's going on. The sixth, when he left, the men of Zimri's tribes rose up to kill him, and the angel fought them off. Yeah. Well, because they wouldn't be natural things. So in other words, God was behind Phinehas' doing of this, of whatever it was, to prove that this act of idolatry was not an act of idolatry, but it was an act of harlotry that Zimri and Cozbi were doing. So this was to prove Phinehas' innocence, that when he killed them, it was okay. Although that raises an interesting question, right? Having sex with a foreign woman, is that a capital punishment?
Well, the problem was they were weeping. There had just been this death and killing, and this is like a flagrant kind of thumbing your nose.
Okay, so it may be a little bit tactless,
Yes.
but is it a crime that deserves capital punishment? Did not Moshe Rabbeinu marry a Midianite woman?
But he married her.
He married.
Well, not at first. I'm sure he took her. And by the way, nowhere in the Bible, in the Bible, the language is very clear. When there is sex involved, the Hebrew that's used is he comes upon her or he takes her. Here, that's not the language of that's being used in either of these stories, either with the daughters of Moab or with this Midianite woman. Those verbs are not used to describe any kind of sexuality. So the Torah itself, I don't believe, intends for us to believe that it was sex. But the Midrash, as you saw in what I just read, makes it very clear that it is unquestionably an act of sexuality.
Well, another expression is he knows her.
He knows her, yeah, exactly, and that's not used either. So all three of them, lakach, ba, and yada, are the three verbs that are used in the Torah to describe some kind of intimate physical act, and those are not used in the story. So it's not a capital punishment crime to have sex with a foreign woman, even if it's in front of Moshe and the whole community. I mean, it may not be appropriate, but it doesn't deserve an act of death. So the question that we have to ask is why? Phinehas goes ahead and does this, and as you can see from the midrash that I just shared with you, is being supported by the angel, which means he's supported by God in what it is that he's doing. And the question is why? Well, let's go back to the text itself.
Well, here it says through the belly.
You want to hear the rest of the 6? I said there's 12, so let me share with you. It's not part of the earlier midrash, but it's interesting. So 6 more miracles were performed for Phinehas. The 7th miracle, the blade of the spear was lengthened until it transfixed both bodies and projected upwards. So the blade right, maybe was started in this side, but now it gets longer and expands, almost like in your mind, what? Yes, exactly. You know, we can't say that word out loud, especially when we're being filmed, but the male organ in the act of procreation, right? So too happens his spear. I don't think it's coincidence that the spear behaves in that manner as a reflection of what is going on, right? Okay. The eighth, the arm of Phinehas was strengthened to support such a burden because he stabs them both, and then he's got to, lift them up and hold them up as his prize for showing what he did. The ninth, the haft of the sword did not break. The 10th, their blood did not descend on Phinehas so that he did not become tameh. Phinehas was a Levite, so he could not become impure. And therefore, he would have become impure if he touched the blood. The 11th, the Holy One, blessed be he, kept them alive so they did not die and caused Phinehas to become tameh, impure. And the 12th, the uppermost to be thrust through is the lower on the spear when it is lifted. But in this instance, Zimri was overturned upon Cozbi as in the act, so that all of Israel could see that their death was ordained. So how does the Midrash feel about the punishment? They're pretty good with it, despite the fact that, as I said, capital punishment should not have been involved. So, back to our text. Nice. By the way, not only should there not be any capital punishment for marrying, having sex with a Midianite woman, but even when Deuteronomy talks about not to be involved with the nations, the 7 nations in the land of Canaan, again, there is no mention at all that if you do, that you'll die. Exactly nothing. So the fact that this was a reason for capital punishment is as unusual as the previous story when God commands Moses to slay all of the chieftains in front of all the people. The punishment seems to be most unusual to the crime that is being committed in either of these events. Exactly. And then when you read the Midrash, it's even more of a shock value. And that's the idea, right? The idea is to stop us in our tracks and say, wow, what will happen if we disobey God? What would it mean if we became, disloyal to the ways of God? And I think that's really, if we're going to jump to the end of this class, that's the purpose of why these stories are here. To remind us of how important it is for us to be loyal and hold fidelity to the one God, which we're going to see this coming week when we read the Torah portion. What's the very first commandments of the Aseret HaDibrot? I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods besides me. You can have multiple women. You just can't. You can have women. You just can't have one God. But in the Bible, the act of prostitution, the act of infidelity in marriage is linked to the act of infidelity to God. How many of you are familiar with the story of Hosea?
Yeah.
Right, Hosea, which is he's the biblical prophet who's read at the very beginning of the book of Numbers. Right, the first parsha in the book of Numbers is co-joined with the story of Hosea. And what is the story of Hosea? It's about his wife who goes around as a harlot to all these other people. And God says to Hosea, take her back in the same way that I will take back my children of Israel who go and commit harlotry against all of the other nations. Not the sexual act, but the act of idolatry. But they're comparable in the Torah over and over again. Okay, I want to, I think did I underline? No, I didn't underline. shoot, it was another copy that I must have printed. So look in the Hebrew. Oh, I did underline? Do you have? Okay, so look in the Hebrew at the words that are underlined. Look at verse chet. Do you see where the little chet is? And I know that not all of you speak Hebrew, but if you look at chet, Vayavo achar ish Yisrael el ha-kubah. El ha-kubah. And if you look in the English, and he went after the man of Israel into the kubah, translated as into the chamber. Vayidkor et shnehem et ish Yisrael v'isha el kavata. What is kavata? It's the same letters, exactly. Through the belly. Right? So kuba and kavta, it's similar. Right? They're similar. So the question is, what is this word? Kaba, kuba, kavta. If you look in the story that takes place prior to this story in the book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 24, that Hebrew word is used 8 times. 8 times it's used. What does it mean? Perhaps, and this I got from Tikva Freimer-Kensky, who was a biblical, she was a wonderful biblical scholar and wrote a number of books, one of them being, forgot what the title of the book was, I think, Reading the Women of the Bible. And in there she says that this word is only found as it is in this place in the Bible. It's the only time that it appears. And she argues that it is some kind of tent or alcove. And it could be like a tent of meeting, like our Ohel Moed, which is where Moses met God and then heard the words of God. So she argues that this kubah might have been a tent where divination took place for the Midianites to their God. And that what this woman is doing, or even more importantly, what this man, Zimri, is doing, this is her idea, he sees this terrible plague that is destroying the children of Israel. So what does he do? Right? He grabs a Midianite woman and says, help us. Help us. Pray to your God to stop the plague. So he builds her a divination tent, which is common in her religious practice. And she goes into the tent, and he goes with her. And he prays to his God, meaning Adonai. And she prays to her God. And is there anything wrong with that?
Well, in God's eyes, there is something wrong with that, because it's not faith in your God. You're saying, help me with your gods. So, it's...
Correct. Right? In the eyes of our Torah, it smacks of the possibility of idolatry. Even though, and this is just Tikva Freimer-Kensky's reading on it, where she claims that all he wants to do is offer intercessory prayers so that the plague is stopped, and he brings in another woman to help, right, and creates this Midianite shrine for her to Phinehas. That smacks of idolatry. So, Phinehas, and what do we know about Phinehas? Well, let's take a look at what do we know about Phinehas. So,
He's a grandson of Aaron.
and the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aharon the priest, has turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, in that he was very jealous. He was kinah. And in the Bible, especially in the book of Exodus, in the 10 Commandments, if you read it this week, you will see that word where God says, I am a jealous God, meaning I do not want you to chase after any other gods. So Phinehas is zealous in fighting for the jealousy of God. Right? He was very jealous for my sake among them, so that I consumed not the children of Israel in my jealousy. Wherefore say, behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace. And it shall be unto him and to his seed after him the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. So God is jealous, kina, over zana, faithlessness. Those two words found very similar. God demands exclusive fidelity. 24,000 people die in this plague, which means it was very swift. There was no judgment. The penalty was very clear. And Phinehas receives a reward for that. Why does Phinehas receive a reward? Because he stops foreign worship in its tracks. He kills the individual who threatens to bring the downfall of the Jewish people through this act of idolatry, of intercessory prayer, which seemingly is harmless when there's a plague that's going on, and he's rewarded for that. Phinehas sees this woman as a danger. Zimri saw this woman as not a danger at all, but as somebody who could possibly help the children of Israel.
How do we know there's a plague going on? It seems as though, am I missing something? Yeah, so the plague was
We know what was going on because it says, and those that died of the plague were 24,000.
Yeah, but then, I mean, like, all of a sudden there's a plague. Okay.
So that's where most biblical scholars will claim these two stories are interlinked together. And they will say that in the first story, when Moshe takes the, not the leaders, but the ones who were committing this crime, he's doing that in response to a plague that was happening when the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And a plague comes about, and God says, impale them, and Moshe slaughters them, and the plague is still happening, and Zimri sees this plague happening, so he grabs Cozbi, and he says, come on in, Cozbi, let me build you a little tent, worship to your Midianite goddess, so that the plague will be stopped. Phinehas sees this, comes along and says, no way, stabs them, and therefore the plague is stopped. And it's this act of Phinehas, who sees in this foreign woman great danger to the community, that the plague is eradicated. Right? No court, no trial, no nothing. It's just over. Who is compared to Phinehas in the Bible? Who also stops a plague from destroying the children of Israel? Elijah. Elijah in his fight against the Baal worshipers. Right? Elijah stands in the breach, just as Phinehas stands in the breach, preventing any foreign elements from entering Israel and preventing anger from God. Right? That's really what I think both of these stories are about. Moshe in the first instance, Phinehas in the second instance. They are asking, who will stand in the breach to stop the Israelites from going astray? In this period of time, what leads us astray? Foreign women. They lead us astray both in idolatry and in sexual immorality. Yeah?
I think Elijah, though, is a little more informed in his actions. He has a lot of reasons behind it. Whereas in the Torah, there are certain characters who have agency, like Phinehas, and they don't have reasons. They just act.
No, but what's interesting is that they're rewarded with a breach shalom.
Yeah, they are. They are rewarded, but they don't have the depth that some other agents have. They're simply vehicles for because they don't see ambiguity.
No. And I'm not sure that's the model. I'm not sure that Phinehas is the model that we want to emulate in our own lives. There is a very interesting commentary when you look at the text that says that he was rewarded this breach shalom. If you look at the Hebrew word very carefully, shalom, the vav is cut. It's not a full vav. And so our commentators say that while he received this covenant of peace, it was a broken covenant of peace because it was created out of this act of zealousness, zealotry, which becomes dangerous to the people of Israel. In fact, we know about the zealotry of the children of Israel much later on in the Second Temple. What destroys the Second Temple? The zealousness of the children of Israel fighting against Rome instead of accommodating Rome. Had they accommodated the Romans, the temple would not have been destroyed. But there were those like Phinehas who refused to accommodate, and for that zealousness, the children of Israel, right, the people of Israel were destroyed. They paid the price. So while the story is in here, on the one hand, right, to teach us a lesson about the dangers of cohabitating with foreign women, or of idolatry, of engaging in the practices of those around us. On the other hand, I think it's very clear that even though he receives this reward, we shouldn't look at this and say this is the way that we should behave. This is not what the Torah is asking us to emulate. But I do think there's an important lesson for us even in this story today. And that is when we look at the world around us, while we may not behave the way the Israelites behaved with the daughters of Moab, or the way that Zimri acted with the woman Cozbi, we could look around and we can say that there's a lot that is attracting the Jewish people outside of the religious confines of Judaism. And we can ask who will stand in the breach to stop, whether it's assimilation or ambiguity or indifference or whatever it may be that's hurting our people. What can we do about it? Right? God isn't going to come along and impale us. Right? That's not the answer anymore, and there's no Phinehas that's going to do what Phinehas did. But what can we do? What are the answers to these, to the modern challenges that face the Jewish community today? Right? That, I think, is still an important lesson that we can ask of these stories in the Bible. Any last thoughts, comments, questions that you have about these texts? All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. And it's really wonderful that you continue to support these programs and learn and engage and better understand the Bible. I know from all your years of studying, you've come away and you've said, is it any wonder that they don't teach these stories to children in religious school?